In August of 1590, an English governor named John White waded ashore onto Roanoke Island, returning with desperately needed supplies. But the 115 men, women, and children he had left behind 3 years earlier were completely gone. The only traces of the settlement were the letters CRO etched into a tree and the word CROATOAN carved into a prominent post. Crucially, there was no Maltese cross. White and the colonists had prearranged that a carved cross would serve as a distress signal if they were removed against their will. For 4 centuries, this complete lack of physical evidence fueled wild speculation. Historians and enthusiasts spun up theories of sudden, violent hurricanes wiping the island clean, or instant massacres that left no survivors. Imperial logistics dictated the colony's isolation. The outbreak of the Anglo-Spanish War, a global conflict for maritime dominance, trapped White back in England as the Crown commandeered every available ship. London effectively abandoned the settlers to fend for themselves. Historians have moved past the supernatural vanishing act, instead applying modern spatial forensics to track the movement of the colonists in the dirt. We know exactly why the colonists had to leave Roanoke Island thanks to a 1998 climatology study. Researchers examined growth rings from ancient bald cypress trees to reconstruct historical climate conditions. This diagram reveals a devastating reality. 1587 marked the beginning of the single most severe growing season and worst drought the region had experienced in 800 years. For a fledgling colony already short on supplies, this drought meant local crops failed entirely. The native Algonquian populations, the indigenous linguistic group of the area, did not have surplus food to trade, meaning that remaining stationary on Roanoke Island was a guaranteed death sentence. Abandoning the Roanoke fort was a forced strategic migration necessitated by environmental collapse. The investigation shifts toward a destination suggested by Governor White's own hand. Before the 1587 colony, he painted an incredibly detailed watercolor map of the region, known as La Virginia Parse. In 2011, researchers at the British Museum placed this centuries-old map on a digital light table. Beneath a small paper patch, they discovered a hidden 4-pointed star drawn in invisible ink, the standard symbol for a fort. This hidden symbol sits 50 miles inland, at the head of the Albemarle Sound, a large estuary on the North Carolina coast. Archaeologists now refer to this specific inland grid as Site X. Excavations at Site X unearthed a specific distribution of physical evidence. Intermingled in the dirt with Native American items were fragments of English borderware pottery. Borderware is a specific type of ceramic used heavily by Elizabethans in the late 1500s. This trajectory proves a premeditated retreat toward friendly Native American hubs, rather than a chaotic flight into the unknown. Geographic search patterns also move 50 miles south of Roanoke, landing on Hatteras Island, specifically at a site called Cape Creek. In the late 16th century, Cape Creek operated as a major settlement and trade hub for the indigenous CROATOAN people. Digging directly into this indigenous dirt, archaeologists found anomalous European objects. They unearthed smelted copper ore, which required European metallurgical techniques, and a slate writing tablet still bearing a faint letter M. The most definitive evidence of a European presence here is Marshall. These are 16th century English rapier hilts. A rapier is a light, sharp sword, typically carried by high-status individuals in Elizabethan England. The presence of high-status English goods deeply embedded in a CROATOAN trade center strongly suggests a second faction of colonists sought refuge here. By connecting these two divergent geographic paths, the overall survival strategy of the Lost Colony becomes clear. Moving over 100 people as a single monolith would have instantly exhausted the local resources of any single host town during a historic drought. They had to distribute their numbers to survive, integrating into the CROATOAN and Algonquian tribes. While retaining small personal heirlooms like swords and writing slates, they fully adopted indigenous survival methods. The Roanoke colonists were not victims of a supernatural event. They were instead survivors of a geopolitical and environmental disaster. The Roanoke settlers survived by trading their English identity for indigenous integration. They demonstrate that to live in a new world, you must occasionally let your old world completely vanish. In December 1872, midway between the Azores and the coast of Portugal, the British vessel Dei Gratia intercepted a mystery. Captain David Morehouse observed a ship moving erratically through the water. Its rigging was damaged, its sails were torn, and the helm was completely unmanned. This was the Mary Celeste. She was structurally sound and carried a valuable cargo, but Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, a seasoned, reliable mariner, was gone. He vanished along with his wife, his infant daughter, and a crew of 7. The ship was in perfectly seaworthy condition. This realization created a maritime puzzle that has occupied investigators for over 150 years. Folklore often claims the boarding party found warm meals and smoking pipes on the tables. In reality, investigators found 6 months of dry provisions stored neatly in the galley, completely untouched. The crew had taken the ship's single yawl boat, the chronometer, and the navigational papers. A chronometer is a highly precise timekeeping instrument used by mariners to determine longitude at sea. This report details the anomalies found on deck. The main hatch was secure, but the fore and lazarette hatches had been removed. The binnacle, which houses the ship's compass, was destroyed, and 3.5 feet of water had pooled in the hold. One specific detail hung over the side of the deck. The main halyard, the thick rope used to hoist the sails, was broken and trailing in the water. The physical evidence indicates 10 people engaged in a sudden, organized evacuation into the open ocean. In early 1873, the ship was towed into the harbor at Gibraltar. The Admiralty Court launched an investigation into potential mutiny or insurance fraud. The lead prosecutor highlighted cuts on the ship's bow and an old sword found beneath the captain's bed, suspecting a violent struggle had taken place. That theory collapsed when Dr. J. Petrone performed a chemical analysis on the sword and the deck. As recorded here, the stains were not blood, but simple rust. In 1884, Arthur Conan Doyle published a fictionalized short story based on the event. The story's popularity replaced the physical facts with a ghost ship narrative in the public imagination. When investigators failed to find a motive, society filled the silence with theories of sea monsters and paranormal intervention. In the 21st century, the investigation's focus shifted to the ship's cargo. Dr. Andrea Sella, a chemist at University College London, conducted a modern experiment to replicate the conditions in the hold. The vessel carried 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, a highly volatile industrial chemical. Shipping records confirm 300 gallons of the liquid had leaked from the barrels during the crossing. This diagram illustrates the pressure wave combustion theory. Alcohol vapor pooled until a spark triggered an explosion, blowing the heavy hatches off. This reaction produces a high-temperature flame followed immediately by cool air, creating a terrifying visual without leaving scorch marks on the wood. The disappearance was caused by invisible fluid dynamics, a chemical blast that left no physical traces for the 19th century boarding party to find. Faced with a ball of fire erupting from the hold, Captain Briggs feared the ship was about to disintegrate. He ordered an immediate evacuation to the yawl boat. As this diagram shows, the crew used the main halyard as a tow line. They tethered themselves to the Mary Celeste at a safe distance, waiting for the alcohol fumes to dissipate before reboarding. But the weather changed. A fresh northerly wind caught the ship's square sails, causing the vessel to accelerate. The tension on the halyard multiplied as the massive brigantine pulled against the overloaded rowboat. The rope reached its breaking point and snapped, severing the connection. The Mary Celeste sailed away on the wind. 10 people were stranded in a small boat in the Atlantic, where they died of exposure. The vessel itself was eventually wrecked off the coast of Haiti years later during a deliberate insurance scam. The Mary Celeste remains a case study in human panic, a failure to predict deterministic physics, and the ocean's indifference. On December 15, 1900, the light at the top of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse went dark. These islands are essentially massive, jagged pillars of rock jutting out of the North Atlantic, and the 3 seasoned keepers stationed there had completely vanished. When a relief crew finally reached the island 11 days later, they found an incredibly eerie scene. The heavy entrance doors were shut tight. Inside, the clocks had stopped. The fireplace was cold, and a table sat waiting. Most chilling of all, 2 sets of heavy outdoor oilskins were missing, but the 3rd keeper's coat was still hanging on its peg. Because the men left behind absolutely no message and no bodies were ever recovered, the public immediately filled that vacuum of information with tall tales. For decades, stories of sea monsters, foreign spies, or sheer madness dominated the conversation. But while the newspapers were busy printing ghost stories, they were ignoring the actual island. The disappearance was the result of a terrifying physical force that the world simply didn't have the tools to measure yet. We know this because of Superintendent Robert Muirhead. He approached the island with the logic of a forensic investigator, conducting a strict engineering audit of the rock to see what the weather had actually done. Muirhead carefully mapped the destruction at the island's west landing. He documented that heavy iron railings set deep into concrete had been violently bent and torn from their sockets. He also found a heavy wooden supply box totally smashed. All of this damage occurred 110 feet above the ocean surface. But the most damning piece of physical evidence was even higher. Exactly 200 feet up, at the very top of the cliff, solid turf had been violently ripped back from the rock. That specific type of erosion requires hundreds of tons of solid green water falling directly from above. Muirhead wrote in his official report that he was satisfied an extra-large sea had overtopped the cliff and swept the men away. His diagnosis perfectly matched the physical destruction on the rock. Yet the scientific establishment of 1900 ignored his conclusion because the physics of the era deemed a wave of that size a mathematical impossibility. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, oceanography was dominated by a concept called the Gaussian sea model. This was a statistical framework that assumed wave heights in the ocean cluster tightly around a predictable average. This chart shows how the Gaussian model predicts ocean behavior. The vast majority of waves fall right here in the middle bulge of the bell curve. As you move to the right, representing taller waves, the probability drops off. According to this math, a 30-meter wave is so rare it should only happen once in 10,000 years. Because this equation worked so well for ordinary seas, it became a rigid orthodoxy. It dictated all naval engineering codes and actively suppressed research into giant waves. Because you don't research something the math says doesn't exist. The problem was, the ocean didn't care about the math. For centuries, veteran sailors and ship captains wrote detailed logs reporting the exact same phenomenon: solitary, vertical walls of water that rose out of nowhere, struck once, and vanished. But because scientists had faith in their bell curve, they dismissed these generations of mariners. If a ship's crew reported a towering rogue wave, the academic establishment simply declared the sailors were panicked or exaggerating. Moving into the mid to late 20th century, the ocean continued to leave physical evidence that shattered the Gaussian curve. Massive, modern steel cargo ships were sinking in seconds, disappearing without even sending a distress call. Take the MS Munich, a highly advanced cargo carrier that went down in the North Atlantic in 1978. Searchers later found one of its lifeboats. The heavy steel mounting pins holding that boat to the ship were bent entirely backward by a massive downward force. That lifeboat had been stowed 20 meters above the waterline. To bend those pins, a solid wall of water had to reach 2 decks high and strike as a single devastating impact. But despite looking right at the bent steel, the official maritime inquiry refused to name the cause because the established scientific models still did not allow for rogue waves. The long-held scientific consensus finally broke on January 1, 1995, at the Dropner oil platform in the North Sea. This is a chart showing the data recorded by an unblinking, downward-facing laser attached to the Dropner platform. It continuously measured the sea state below. Right in the middle of a standard winter storm, the laser plotted a single solitary wave measuring 25.6 meters from trough to crest. There was no room left for blaming frightened sailors. It took the cold, calibrated numbers of an industrial machine to finally validate what human eyes had been seeing for over a century. In 2001, the European Space Agency launched the MaxWave project. They used synthetic aperture radar to conduct a global census of the sea surface. Synthetic aperture radar is a high-resolution mapping technology that uses a moving satellite antenna to create detailed 3D snapshots of the ocean surface. The results were staggering. In a window of just 3 weeks, the satellites detected more than 10 giant waves exceeding 25 meters across the globe. Physicists quickly went to work identifying the mechanics behind the phenomenon, specifically nonlinear focusing. Nonlinear focusing is a process where energy from a group of neighboring waves concentrates into a single explosive crest. The data identifies rogue waves as constant, predatory features of our oceans that we were previously unable to track. Equipped with modern oceanographic mechanics, we can return to Island Moore and look at the evidence through a 21st century lens. Based on Muirhead's forensic logic, we can reconstruct the final moments. Keepers Ducat and Marshall are standing exposed at the 110-foot landing, struggling to secure heavy gear in a rising gale. Back up at the lighthouse, MacArthur sees something terrifying forming offshore. He rushes down the stairs to deliver a desperate warning, not even stopping to grab his coat. But he is too late. A massive rogue crest, amplified by wave-current interaction, scales the vertical cliff face. It overtops the landing entirely, ripping iron from concrete, and erases the three men instantly. For 100 years, an elegant mathematical equation convinced the world that a horrific reality was just a fairy tale. But the truth was carved into the rocks of the Flannan Isles all along. We simply lacked the humility to read it. The Mato Grosso region of the Amazon basin covers hundreds of thousands of square miles of dense, seemingly impenetrable rainforest. In 1925, British explorer and military officer Lieutenant Colonel Percy Fawcett entered this jungle searching for a lost civilization and was never heard from again. Fawcett possessed an absolute conviction that the Amazon hid an ancient, complex society. As he wrote in his journal, "The Z, a missing piece, I know it." For decades following his disappearance, mid-20th century anthropologists broadly dismissed Fawcett as an eccentric chasing fairy tales. The scientific consensus of the era held that the Amazon was a pristine, hostile wilderness. Its soil was considered too poor, and its environment too harsh to sustain dense urban centers. Modern archaeological data reveals a striking historical twist. Fawcett misjudged the city's appearance, yet his core assumption of its existence proved accurate. The Amazon was a highly urbanized, engineered landscape. Understanding it requires us to discard traditional definitions of what constitutes a city. Reconstructing the fate of the 1925 expedition requires aligning Victorian historical narratives with 21st century spatial data. Fawcett reached a dead end because he assumed a tropical civilization would share the same physical footprint as a European city. Fawcett's search criteria were heavily influenced by Manuscript 512, an 18th century Portuguese document that claimed a lost city existed in the deep jungle. The manuscript described specifically European architectural features, claiming to have found city squares, statues, and entrances ornamented with triple archways, similar to Roman triumphal arches. These claims clash with the geological reality of the Amazon basin, which lacks quarryable stone. Even if the stone were available, the weight of monumental European architecture would quickly sink and fracture in the saturated mud of a tropical rainforest. Centralized agriculture fails here. Heavy rains wash nutrients away, leaving soil too poor to sustain large populations. Due to lacking stone and nutrient-poor soil, mid-century academics categorized a city like Z as impossible. Fawcett sought specific European architecture in a landscape that demanded a completely different engineering logic. In 1925, Fawcett utilized a highly mobile three-man unit consisting of himself, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel to minimize logistical drag. He purposefully avoided large caravans to reduce friction with indigenous tribes, knowing a massive footprint would deplete local food supplies. In April 1925, this small team departed from Cuiabá, marching into the uncharted territory of the Mato Grosso. The final dispatch sent by Fawcett provides exact coordinates. He wrote, "Here we are at Dead Horse Camp, lat 11 degrees 43 south and 54 degrees 35 west." Journalist David Gran later recovered the oral history of the Kalapalo tribe, the last group to see Fawcett's party alive. The Kalapalo warned Fawcett against traveling further east into territory controlled by hostile indigenous groups. Fawcett pressed on. The Kalapalo watched the smoke from the expedition's campfire rise each evening for 5 days before it vanished. Fawcett died searching for stone monuments that were never there. The exact region he vanished in, the Upper Xingu, contained massive urban centers hidden just below the surface. His map was correct, but his specific expectations for a city's appearance blinded him to the evidence beneath his boots. In 2008, anthropologist Michael Heckenberger published a paper in the journal Science that challenged the pristine wilderness theory. Heckenberger revealed a settlement pattern called galactic urbanism. A single central node is surrounded by a cluster of smaller satellite settlements, all linked by wide, perfectly straight roads. They performed massive earthworks, carving deep, concentric, circular moats around these settlements. Tall wooden palisades operated alongside these moats, creating heavy defensive fortifications. These geometric trenches remain visible in the landscape today, proving the immense scale of pre-Columbian earthworks. This raises a question: how did a civilization feed tens of thousands of people in nutrient-poor tropical soil? The solution was terra preta, a Portuguese term for black Indian earth. This soil is human-made. By systematically infusing the ground with charcoal, pottery shards, and organic waste, these societies permanently enriched the earth. Terra preta allowed the Upper Xingu polities to practice high-yield agriculture. The Amazon was a heavily managed landscape, meticulously engineered by its inhabitants over centuries. If this massive civilization existed, why did Fawcett find only empty jungle in 1925? The answer lies in the timeline following European contact in the early 16th century. European arrivals on the coasts inadvertently introduced novel infectious diseases to the continent. These pathogens traveled inland along the same indigenous trade networks and wide roads that connected the galactic cities. The resulting mortality rate devastated the interior populations, decades before European explorers ever physically reached the region. Without maintenance, the structural vulnerability of wood and earth architecture became a fatal flaw. Unlike stone, organic building materials require constant human care. When left untended, the Amazon jungle rapidly reclaims its territory. Within a few generations, the walls rotted and the moats filled with debris. Only the terra preta survived, an invisible matrix of engineered soil. These facts provide a different perspective on Percy Fawcett's legacy. The colonial texts he relied on were fabricated, yet his underlying belief that a complex society thrived in the deep jungle was accurate. Percy Fawcett spent his final days exploring a post-apocalyptic graveyard. The actual Z functioned as a sophisticated work of ecological engineering, a city built from soil and trees rather than gold and stone.